everyone, and welcome to Social Psychology. I know this unit, there's a lot of readings, so I really am going to try this week to condense it. Even though this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, I want to make sure we get bite-sized bits of the most important information. So, social psychology. Before we get into that, I want to talk about our learning objectives. As always, these are important to test our learning and comprehension, and that we get the major points of our reading. So we want to define social psychology, describe situational versus dispositional influences on behavior, and we're going to talk about different theories and how we apply and describe those situational and dispositional factors, including the fundamental attribution error, actor-observer bias, self-serving bias, and the just world hypothesis, and how this translates to other social psychological phenomena we're going to talk about within this unit. So social psychology basically examines how people affect one another. So we talked last unit about personality, right? We have all these individual traits and features about ourselves. We do a lot of intrapersonal understanding about how people, communicate in an individual level, like within themselves. But now we're looking at interpersonal. So we have that understanding of ourselves, but how do we use that self in connection with others? So that's what we're talking about with inter and intrapersonal topics. So how we are affected by groups, peer pressure, if you will. That is one of the topics we examine in social psychology. We're looking at the power of the situation that may dictate or change some behaviors that someone may exhibit just through the pressure of having others around. So when we talk about situational versus dispositional influences on behavior, we are going to look at, it's kind of like nature versus nurture, but not. But same kind of principle. We're looking at factors within ourselves, or how we, internal factors. That's dispositionism. It's when we credit things and circumstances to the individual or a trait that they have. Whereas situationism looks at how our behavior is determined by our surroundings. So it looks at the influence of everything around us and how that affects our understanding. And we're going to do a lot of examples to elaborate on this. But that's the gist of it. So when we talk about dispositionism, this is very common in the United States. And we have to question why. Well, inherently, we are an individualistic society, and we focus on the individual, and through hard work and determination, anyone can do what they want to be, who they want to be. Well, this mindset kind of influences how we perceive people's situations or effects of their situation. We very readily attribute something that happens to someone as being a part of their personality as opposed to their circumstance. I'll give an example in the next slide. But those internal factors, we say it's an attribute of a person and concludes their personality traits and temperament all because of an interaction. I know I've done this, you've done it, we all have done it. Maybe you saw a kid having a temper tantrum in public. And you said, oh, that's just a bad kid. They don't listen. That's just a bad kid. Right? That's an attribute of their personality. We're saying that's an internal factor. That's a bad kid. Right? That is a dispositionist type of assessment. What we want to look at is situationism. How often do we say, oh, maybe that kid's having a bad day. Maybe they're hungry. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they're having trouble at school. Right? We don't think of the surrounding circumstances. We think of it as a result of that individual person. And sometimes with those traits, that can lend itself to a sort of halo effect. When we see someone as doing well or excelling in one area, we have this overall impression how we feel about their character. So take if a student is really good in their psychology class, right? Maybe that professor says, oh, this student is really impressive in my class. And we paint the picture that the student is good in all their classes. That's the halo effect. Doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but let's say I'm the teacher in question. I'll just use me as an example. But I'm letting that impression from my one class kind of determine all the traits about that student. They could just be good in my class because they like it and not enjoy any of their other classes. So that's kind of halo effect, how one trait can kind of permeate how we assess a person as a whole. So with the fundamental attribution error, I'm going to read you this quick example, and I want you to think of how you would explain this behavior. But Jamie returns home from work and opens the front door to a happy greeting from spouse Morgan, who inquires how the day has been. Instead of returning to spouse's kind greeting, Jamie yells, "Leave me alone!" Why did Jamie yell? Well, some of you might have said, well, Jamie just sounds like a mean person, or Jamie had a bad day. And those types of responses can kind of be indicative of dispositional or situational attribution style. So if you said something about Jamie's personality or an intrinsic quality of Jamie, Jamie's a jerk, they are a mean person, that's dispositional. Whereas Jamie sounds like they have a bad day, is situational. And we commit this fundamental attribution error. We attribute, we assume or assess someone's behavior as a result of their traits and underestimate the power of the situation. So we're not understanding, maybe Jamie just had a horrible day or someone almost hit their car on the way home. We're saying, no, it's because of who Jamie is. Again, more common in individualistic cultures than collectivistic cultures. And, the U.S. is the predominant one. We're going to talk about U.S., U.K., Western European influences. But that is one of the errors we make. Continuing off of that same vein of the fundamental attribution error, we kind of misplaced the blame. We also do this to other people, but in a different way. In a different way for ourselves, because we are wonderful. We always want to see ourselves in this positive light. So let me have another example. If someone speeds past you, driving down the 264, driving erratically, how do you explain the behavior? That person's an a-hole, they drive like crap, or, something about who they are as a person. That's the fundamental attribution error. If you catch yourself speeding down the 264 and driving erratically, how do you explain the behavior? Maybe you cut someone off on accident. You're like, oh, I'm so sorry, it was an accident. Like, I was just trying to switch lanes to avoid this accident. That is another kind of offshoot of the fundamental attribution error. The actor-observer bias is when we attribute other people's behaviors to traits that they have, but our behaviors to our situations. So the best example that I can give is, they got an F because they're lazy, they don't work hard, and they just don't listen in class. I got an F because Miss Elizabeth hates me. That is actor-observer bias. I don't hate anyone, just for the record, but I'm using it as a silly example. But saying that the other person's results or behaviors are a result of their traits, they're inherently lazy. I think you're picking up what I'm putting down, and whereas you are a victim of circumstance. That keeps this kind of self-serving bias. We attribute other people's behavior to internal factors while attributing our own to situational. That serves our self-serving bias so that we see ourselves in this positive light all the time. Because we want to think that we are good, right? Sometimes we do different things with our locus of control, that's Julian Rotter. Stability and controllability, we attribute behaviors and results and circumstances based on, traits that we have, other internal or external factors influencing it. So the wording I hear is, I got an A in my history class. I got an A, but Mrs. Elizabeth gave me an F. Okay? Do you see the difference there? You're saying one is internal and you earned it, whereas our failures we dismiss to circumstance. Our brains want to view us positively all the time. That is the point you get out of this section. And that interferes with how we relate to our in-groups and our out-groups, which we're going to talk about next. And when we attribute things or misattribute them, this can lead to some serious social ramifications on a larger scale, such as victim blaming. We have this idea in the United States of the just world hypothesis. And this is the idea that people get the outcomes they deserve. Now this goes back to our attribution styles. We want to believe that sometimes, we want to believe bad things happen to bad people. Because I don't want to think that I'm one paycheck away from being homeless, right? So people have this idea that if something bad happens to you, it's because you earned it. And they maintain this because it helps them give them some stability and controllability to things that are largely uncontrollable and unstable. And so, while it makes people psychologically feel better to say these things, it's not necessarily true. There isn't this just world. We know, like, bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people, right? But it gives us the illusion that, oh, well, if they would have just saved up their money, they wouldn't have been homeless. We try to excuse and think there's a reason for that, what happened to them. Seen a lot of victim blaming in the cases of, like, sexual assault, or more recently with the cases of George Floyd and other Black Americans who have been killed or unfairly treated by our criminal justice system. A lot of victim blaming because we say that their situation or what happened to them is a result of who they are as a trait, and it's an error that we have to kind of seek to rectify and recognize. So saying things like, oh, well, poor people are just lazy, or people on welfare want to live off the government. What were they wearing when it happened? The list goes on of different types of victim blaming quotes. This is all a result of a fundamental attribution error. You're trying to create logic and reasoning for an event that happened where there really isn't one. We're going to talk about this more and how it relates to our in-groups and out-groups, as well as how it relates to conformity, obedience, compliance, prejudice, discrimination, and more. So stay tuned.